Welcome to the 2022 Scottish Episcopal Institute lecture, the 7th in our series. As principal of the Institute, I'm delighted that, looking at the screen, about 80 of you have chosen to participate in this event online. It's really good to be with you all tonight. Aidan Strange, the Church's Digital Communications Coordinator, Richard Tiplady, Director of Mixed Mode Training at SEI, and I are sitting in the General Synod office here in Edinburgh. Our honoured speaker, the Reverend Professor Sarah Coakley, is in northern Massachusetts. Professor Coakley, on behalf of everyone present, a very warm Scottish welcome. We are delighted to have you as our speaker to reflect on worship and desire in the Anglican tradition, why this matters in contemporary church and culture. Now, you've asked that there not be a lengthy introduction, and as we have shared details of your illustrious academic career on our website in advance of this lecture, I won't rehearse those here. But what I do want to say is that what stands out in that account is the way in which, in your writing and in your practice, you have exemplified the ancient definition of a theologian, one who prays. You have shown how the rational exercise of theology mustn't be severed from the embodied practice of theology, and have demonstrated a contemplative approach to systematics. I know we will hear more in that vein this evening, and I, for one, am looking forward hugely to what you will share with us. But before you do that, I will hand over to my colleague Richard Tiplady, who will briefly outline how the Q&A session afterwards will operate.
Thank you, Anne, and good evening, everyone. As Anne said, there will be time for Q&A after the lecture, and I would ask you, if you have a question during the lecture, please post it into the chat function on Zoom. It's been enabled only so that the staff can see it. There's no opportunity for comment that others can see. But as issues arise during the lecture that you may be able to hear a little bit more about, please feel free to put the question in the chat, and we'll hopefully have the opportunity to take some of those with Sarah after the lecture. There will be a short break after the lecture, a standard 5-minute screen break before we go to the Q&A. But there will hopefully be good time for all your questions to be answered afterwards. So at this point, it's my pleasure to hand over to Sarah and give my thanks to her as well for her preparation and her willingness to give her time to us this evening here, lunchtime, where she is. So Sarah, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much. And I want to say first how honoured I am by this invitation to give this annual lecture at the STI, and especially, of course, to Anne and Richard for the why this topic now, and desire to begin with. My interest, as I shall shortly show, resides first in outlining the particular moral and spiritual difficulties with which our topic, desire, is larded in our contemporary culture. A culture of advertisement, the World Wide Web, social media, the widespread availability of soft pornography, and the post-Freudian general presumption of what I shall call the sexualization of desire. What is perhaps less widely reflected upon is the equal thematic centrality of desire and cognate terms as a topic in the fundamental biblical witness, in classic Christian thought, and particularly in historic Anglican reflection. Its deep entanglement with the core theme of our fundamental relation to God in prayer and worship, and its significance for understanding both that longing for God in God's self and for comprehending the distortions of the desiring faculty in our propulsion towards sin. In short, as I shall chart afresh tonight, desire is a topic that lies crucially at the intersection of human sin and salvation. And in order to think about it afresh, against the blandishments of the hidden secular persuaders of our culture, we shall first need to probe some forgotten materials out of the tradition, and also think afresh and somewhat challengingly about how ministers of the gospel specifically have the dangerous but creative task, especially in worship, and whether consciously or unconsciously, of educing and directing desire towards God. By desire in this lecture, then, I shall mean the conative, motivational, longing core of the self that is evident in the human from the very moment of birth and up to, and according to some patristic witnesses, such as Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, even beyond the gates of death. Desire in us stretches out in longing, as Nissen puts it. And though its closeness and entanglement with conscious will and intellect is obvious, desire as such may be seen as deeper and wider than both of them, in the sense that it is vitally linked to bodily life as well as psychic life. And note, it predates speech. The newborn comes with the fundamental desire for human intimacy, warmth, and nurture, for instance. It is manifested vibrantly, too, in those who, tragically, through handicap, have no speech. And it can also post-date speech in the dying. The dying person still longs, we might say, as anyone who sits alongside a dying person will testify. Desire, then, as Thomas Aquinas put it, is natural to us, both in linking and mediating bodily and psychic needs and propulsions, and, says Thomas, in connecting us, albeit obscurely, to God in God's self, our ultimate source and goal and desire. And desire, as both Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century and Augustine in the early 5th taught with complexity and sophistication, though with different emphases, it is also most fundamentally what goes wrong in sin. In terms of Genesis 3, the fall is not merely an act of disobedience, though it is that, of course, but perhaps more deeply and significantly, as both Nissen and Augustine taught in their different ways, a corruption or misdirection or misaggregation of desires. Only look again at Genesis 3 and you'll find it dripping with Hebrew words for desire. So desire is a category of core human selfhood, with widespread and ambivalent attachments towards which it is propelled, ranging from the divine and the good and the beautiful to the corrupt and the harmful and the sinful. It is how these two poles relate that will concern us in what follows, and what this has to do with how we comport ourselves in prayer and worship. But first, and by way of brief further introduction, I want to illustrate how deeply this theme informs the conception of worship and praise in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and especially in the Psalms, and how it is also more fundamental than commonly thought in the teaching of Jesus himself and of Paul, especially in relation to prayer. Only consider then the core theme of longing or desiring or thirsting for God throughout the Psalm corpus. Like as the heart desireth the water brook, so longeth my soul for thee, O God. My soul thirsts for God, yea, for the living God. Psalm 42. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire other than you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Psalm 73. Or again, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul has a desire and longing to enter into the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh rejoice in the living God. Psalm 84. And many more. These are some of the most memorable turns of psalmic phrase, using a variety of Hebrew words to express longing, thirst, or desire. But the basic theme of desire for God drips, I would say, from all the Psalms, and would undeniably have been enshrined in Jesus's evident memorizing of them. And despite the fact that Jesus, at least when he's translated into Greek, seems to avoid eros language, erotic language, in favor of the word agape, love language, a matter that was made hugely polemical in Anders Nygren's famous wartime text, Agape and Eros, with agape cast as the greedy, grasping, Platonic or Pelagian desire over against Jesus's self-giving, grace-filled agape. It would be wholly misleading, I think, to cast Jesus's teaching as neglectful of desire in the wider sense we've just outlined from the Psalms. For what is his core teaching on the kingdom, if not, at base, the decision and choice always for what really matters before God, what is truly deserving of our desire, if you like? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Matthew 6:21 and parallels. The pearl of great price, the treasure buried in the field, the lost coin or sheep, are not all these parables of the kingdom parables of choices and priorities in desires? If not, and is not indeed the Lord's Prayer itself, when you think about it, a modulator of desires, which puts God and his kingdom and his holy name first in the order of imprecation, and then ranges everything else that is very important and desirable under those. More specifically, the author of Luke's Gospel makes Jesus's final and most intense desire in his earthly life that of celebrating his own Passover and Last Supper with his disciples. As he puts it literally, with desire I have desired to eat this Eucharist with you, Luke 22:15. Epithumia, epithumesa. The Eucharist then already becomes, at least according to Luke, the climax of longing in worship and unity by Christ and with Christ. And thus, implicitly, we might say, it is already the place where desires are tested and sorted in relation to God in Christ. Jesus, on the night before he dies, gives us something very specific and practical to do to evince this testing of desires. It should not be as surprising as it might seem, therefore, that 1 Corinthians 11 is a place where Paul brings together, if you think about it, in seemingly random association, all the problems of class and wealth and gender and sexuality and the quarrels and spite about them that are going on at Corinth, precisely in connection, bang in the middle of that chapter, with his teaching on the Lord's Supper. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread. The Last Supper narrative is inserted right into that discourse about the Corinthians' multiple squabbles about what they desire and how they disagree about it. It is not far-fetched, then, I put it to you, to read Paul's instructions on the Eucharist as a site of potential condemnation, of course, as well as salvific grace, as precisely a teaching on the orderings of desires in relation to the Eucharist. By the same token, Paul's great exordium on Christian prayer in Romans 8 tells us that the whole creation waits with eager longing, verse 19, a apokaradokia, earnest expectation, is often translated, for the appearance of the children of God. And since we don't rightly know what to ask for, says Paul, i.e., what best to desire in prayer, it is the ecstasy of the Spirit, with sighs too deep for words, that must guide us in taking us to the Father through the sufferings and glory of Christ himself. The polemical disjunction, then, made so influentially by Anders Nygren, Bishop of Lund, between Platonic desire, eros, and Christian love, agape, begins to look decidedly misleading in the light of these biblical reflections. The multiple words used for desire or longing scriptures, it's actually between 20 and 30 in Hebrew and several more in Greek, as we've already indicated, already complicate and blur that supposed disjunction. No wonder then that so many of the early Christian traditions, among them Origen in the 3rd century, the Cappadocians in the late 4th, and Augustine, did not see Platonism's and Neoplatonism's teaching on eros, longing or desire, as necessarily inimical to Jesus's teaching on love, agape, but rather in a mutually fecund critical relationship. As Nissen put it, love, eros, is agape stretched out in longing. And as I have charted recently in the first volume of my own systematic theology, God, Sexuality, and the Self, this marriage of biblical and Platonic thought, combined with early Christian commentaries on that great book, the Song of Songs in the Old Testament, was ultimately to raise the notion of divine eros to a sort of metaphysical principle that comes already in origin, but most clearly in the work of the 5th century or early 6th century writer Dionysius the Areopagite in his Divine Names, chapter 4, who was to have incalculable influence on later Western scholasticism and Eastern Byzantine thought, respectively. On this view, what desire finally is to be found in God, not in us. It is that never ceasing stretching out by God to scoop us up into participation and grace in his life. In short, on this vision, it is God in God's self who is the true source and goal of all human desires, when suitably purified and redirected through grace from the effects of sin, that is, through the processes of sanctification. Now, so much by way of initial theorizing of desire, both semantically and biblically. And we shall return to these themes shortly. We must now go forward from here contrapuntly, however, into the very different world of our postmodern secular commodifications of desire. I seek here not to demonize secular culture, as we shall see. This isn't prurient or punitive, but at the very least to indicate how subject we all are ourselves, even as Christian believers and practitioners, to the assumed blandishments of that culture. So section 1, if you have the handout printed out in front of you, this is called The Commodification of Desire in Contemporary Culture. Sex, power, money, and belongings. Only consider first, as a slightly eye-opening, or at least it was to me, emblem of the issues I seek to highlight under this rubric, an article that came out in the Sunday Times Colour Supplement a few years ago. I think it was the 23rd of June, 2018. And its title was Sex and Consent in the Me Too Era, What Young Men Really Think. And it describes in disturbingly matter-of-fact terms what might be called the normalization of pornography as a sort of replacement for sex education in the lives of young men and women, but perhaps especially men, both straight and gay, and the decline of, I suppose, what we could call courtship in this latest generation of adolescents and young adults in favor of quick web-arranged hookups purely for the hasty satisfaction of the sexual urge. I cannot help commenting as a Christian feminist that for this we should read usually for the hasty satisfaction of the male sexual urge, because one of the things that comes out in this article is how unsatisfying this is for the women. The author of the Times article commented, however, a reliance on dating apps and social media as a way of meeting people means that you often have a fairly good idea of whether you are going to sleep with someone before you've even spoken to them, which the interviewee here, called Dexter, laments. As he puts it, it's strange because as soon as you've met, it's like, okay, we've had a drink, now let's have sex. There is no middle ground, he goes on. I don't think our generation knows how to woo people anymore. Another interviewee, Monty, describes how he enjoyed a year of such regular promiscuity before sexually burning out, feeling fragmented and unsatisfied. Ultimately, he deleted Tinder and his other social media sites from his iPhone, even disgusted at the way that pornography and promiscuous sex had caused him to objectify women and distance himself from them. And this note without any inputs whatsoever from Christian critique. However, the Me Too movement is also a complicating matter in the sexual arena, as this Times article went on to explore, causing the ultimate cultural contradiction between mandated, normalized promiscuity on the one hand, and prurient threats of legal punishment on the other. We know how mental health suffers all round in this scenario. So what is at stake, and why is there no convincing theorizing, certainly not within this Saturday Times article as an example, about the very nature of erotic desire in itself and its ultimate satisfactions? Our postmodern secular culture is not devoid of good desiring instincts, I insist. And this troubled article also dimly articulates such an intuition. It's questing for something. But the problem is that there seems to be no obvious moral compass to assess the choices, except insofar as liberal rights thinking in connection to the Me Too movement has put a certain brake on the rampant masculinist hedonism, which might otherwise be valorized. But here, the crude sexualization of desire in popular post-Freudian culture is not the only problem. I suggest we need to look more widely. For it is often not acknowledged that sexual desire is aroused and manipulated in a culture which ties many other desires into its tether. For eroticism, as we've already noted, especially in the Platonic Christian tradition, is much wider and deeper than sex. Something, incidentally, that Freud understood a great deal better than many of his later followers. There's desire for wealth, for political power, for status, for material belongings, and the denial of death as well. And these are all entangled with these other reflections on sex in the weekend newspapers and the glossy magazines. When I was still teaching at the University of Cambridge, I would come home from celebrating the Eucharist very early in the morning on Saturday, and sit down at my kitchen table and read these Saturday Times color sups, and become acutely aware of how I was living in two completely different worlds which didn't seem to meet. As the American theologian James K.A. Smith illuminates in his 2-volume study of desire and the kingdom, it's perhaps the case that our shopping malls have in a way become the new cathedrals, places where we go to wander in secular analogues to labyrinths, forgetful of time and responsibility, deliberately, albeit somewhat unconsciously, releasing ourselves from ordinary constraints. In this case, to buy and spend and own, though if we went to the cathedral, there would be another set of constraints and desires. Or, when in contrast, rather than going out to shop, we surfed the web for desirable goods, our credit cards at the ready option. We once more, I think, collude with the hidden persuaders who elicit, redirect, and intensify our desires for a variety of goods and ends. But this is not just a matter of private gratification, as it may seem as we strain over our laptops in the silent watches of the night. But this is at least half the delusion. As William T. Kavanagh spells out unforgettably in his wonderfully Augustinian little book, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire, all our consumer choices have much wider political and economic implications. By the supposedly free choices we make for our own money, or alas, sometimes our indebted lack of it, we buy into societies that either are or are not sustaining of freedom and justice in varying degrees. But these days, all societies are in one way or another connected to each other, making it impossible for us to wash our hands of what is going on the other side of the world. As Kavanagh put it prophetically, quote, "I present globalization as a way of seeing, an aesthetic that configures space and human subjects in peculiar ways. Implicit in my argument," he goes on, "is the conviction that culture and economics are not autonomous spheres with no mutual effect, Economic relationships do not operate on value-neutral laws, but are rather carriers of specific convictions about the nature of the human person, the person's origins and destiny. There is an implicit anthropology and an implicit theology in every economics, says Kavanagh. This remark by Kavanagh about globalization as a way of seeing is, I think, particularly prescient. For every choice in desire is indeed an aesthetic as well as a moral choice. What we choose not to see as we choose to buy is what we learn by repeated habit not to see. The desirable consumer object insidiously comes to replace the capacity to see the needy other at the end of the food and money chain. The grasping consumerism of so much affluent, or alas, not at all affluent life, is thus curiously connected, or at least I suggest so, to the distanced objectification of the female body in now normalized pornography, and to the blindness about racism and its effects, both at home and in the wider world. In other words, when desire goes wrong, one of the more insidious outcomes is an incapacity to see certain things and certain people. Desire, then, is continually intensified by our consumerist culture. But to what end and to what satisfaction? But when our desires are diffused and ununified in their direction and intent, we can no longer see in the important sense that the early church spoke of in relation to what it called spiritual sensation and its requirements. We need to learn to see Christ, and from the perspective of Christ. As Gregory of Nyssa wrote in relation to the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, the deep irony here is that neither the righteous nor the unrighteous in this story yet recognize that they have or have not been serving Christ in the poor and the needy. Even the righteous grope forward, making the right choice, but not yet aware that they are making them. Gregory of Nyssa's admittedly unsystematic theory of the development of spiritual sensation thus involved a lifetime of the retraining of bodily and psychic desire in order to see Christ, especially and consciously in the faces of the poor. And this, he taught, was by definition an erotic undertaking, a long haul, a spiritual operation in the right direction of desire, in grace and under the power of the Spirit, which affected all the senses as well as the intellect and the will. And this now brings us to our second section. For if the secular manipulations of the commodification of desire according to ends which serve to fragment and divide are so often unconscious, even to the faithful in our own time, how can our prayer and worship become more consciously vibrant to the progressive undoing of sinful desires and false perceptions, and the redirection of desire to God in Christ? So now I come to the second section, charting the ordering of desires, the negative passions, and the crucible of prayer. Happily, we are not without classic Christian resources to help us in this task, for the problem of sorting and ordering of desires was a key element of desert spirituality, especially from the time of the beginnings of monastic life in Egypt. And those theologians like Gregory of Nyssa, who watched these developments admiringly from a different and slightly removed perspective, whether in Cappadocia or Constantinople, in the towns at any rate, are as important, if not more so, for contemporary Christians who now seek to lead a life of ordered, agapeic, come erotic desire, yet without necessarily eschewing marriage as the monastics did, or eschewing sex and family. For Gregory of Nyssa, it was just as important for all Christians to be engaged in this lifelong transformation of desire as it was for the monks. Indeed, Nissen's early text, it was his first published writing on virginity, is, as I've argued elsewhere, a unique and remarkable one for his time in insisting that well-conducted marriage, in Christian terms, is as good or nearly as good as well-conducted celibacy, such as his admired older brother Basil of Caesarea embraced. For what these lifestyles have in common over against badly conducted marriage or badly conducted celibacy or monasticism is not, according to Gregory, the suppression of desires and passions, but actually their intensification in God in the right direction. Adjusting Platonic themes, especially from Plato's text, the Phaedrus, Gregory can start to sketch here a vision of transformed desires in which even bad passions can, over time, and in the power of the Spirit in sanctification, be transmuted into good ones. The dark horse that the charioteer rides in the Phaedrus story can, with all renewed energy, pull the chariot towards the heavenly goal once the darkness of that passion has been purified. The point is that the energy is not lost, it's transmuted. But there are no shortcuts to this kind of transformation. It was a contemporary of Gregory's in the late 4th century, who he may or may not have known personally, Evagrius of Pontus, who systematized and theorized the early wisdom of the Egyptian monks in this period most extensively. And in his wonderful little text on prayer, later enshrined in the Eastern monastic collection, the Philokalia, he spelled out the whole panoply of dark passions, or thoughts, as he called them, logismoi, dark desires, that can and will assail the monastic or the Christian as he or she goes deeper into the depths of the self and sees for the first time the immensity of sin and self-deception that lies there waiting to be transformed through humility and hope. The point is, first, that there is no such transformation, according to Evagrius, without a commitment to a demanding and necessarily disturbing lifelong adventure in prayer. The devil does not like our progress, warns Evagrius, and thus will do anything to throw us off course. But secondly, there is no going on without going down into these depths. This is true spiritual prayer, as he calls it, and it's the only way of purification, difficult and dangerous as it is. I quote, "What is it that the demons wish to excite in us? Gluttony, unchastity, avarice, anger, and the rest of the passions, so that the intellect grows coarse and cannot pray as it ought." This is on prayer number 51. Thirdly, then, according to Evagrius, it's only by resisting and fighting these thoughts and rationalizations that the spirit can, through this great battle of sanctification, be let in to do its work of purification and ecstasy into pure or spiritual prayer, which also brings calming and soothing to the body. As the contemporary spiritual writer Martin Laird, OSA, so brilliantly expounds Evagrius for today, let me commend his little book, A Sunlit Absence. It is these thoughts, these negative passions, these logismoi that always catch us out. We spend our life on the back foot, justifying in endless wordy recitations to ourselves why our negative passions are, in our case, of course, wholly righteous, especially in relation to anger and blame of the other. Progress is only made if we begin in the spirit to exercise what Evagrius, following here the Stoics, but with a rather different evocation, calls apatheia. This is a letting go in prayer into a form of dispassion or dispossession, where the spirit's ecstasy can take us to a new level of unself-centeredness and stillness, hesychia. Hence, as Evagrius puts it, you cannot attain pure prayer while entangled in things and agitated by constant cares. For prayer ultimately means the shedding of thoughts. It is the crucible of prayer then, and only that crucible, that allows the possibility for the ordering and sorting of desires, good and bad, physical and psychic. This is where we begin to see that our sexual desires cannot be disconnected from that tether of all other desires, both sinful and good, and that it is desire for God that finally conjoins them all and draws them into progressive purification. Now, in the West, it was left to later synthesizers of desert wisdom, such as Evagrius's, with scholastic Thomism, to supply yet more wondrous and demanding, but wholly realistic accounts of Christian ways of desire and worship. Amongst these, I think most would agree, the supreme Western cartographer of desire is undeniably the 16th century John of the Cross, whose teaching on the dark nights is, alas, still widely taken to be hostile to human affectivity and physicality, and of relevance only to contemplative elites. But nothing could be further from the truth. John himself taught that any Christian who even sets out on a relatively serious prayer life will quickly hit what he calls the night of sense, in which nothing seems to be meaningful anymore in relation to God in prayer, because positive prayer affects have been withdrawn by God to test and purify and ultimately unify our desire. The point, teaches John, is that we are learning how to pray not for our own satisfaction, but for God. And as this radical sorting of our desires begins to come into effect, we feel all at sea and are sure that nothing is going aright. But this prayer is the crucible, the metabolic locus of the transformation of all desires. And it is only by passing through this crisis that we begin to see how our physical desires, including our sexual desires, are vitally related to one another, but in a subordinate mode to our primary relation to God, such that eventually all will be returned to us affectively, rejoicing in union and in the Spirit. As John writes in Book 1 of The Dark Night, 4:7, people miss this often, increased sexual attraction, not the opposite, is a potential sign of progress, albeit a dangerous moment, in this transition into the first night of sense, when prayer appears to go dead. He writes, some spiritually acquire a liking for other individuals that often arises from lust rather than from the Spirit. This lustful origin will be recognized, however, if on recalling that affection, there is remorse of conscience, not an increase in the remembrance and love of God. The affection, however, is purely spiritual if the love of God grows when it grows, or if the love of God gives the soul a desire for God, if by growing in one, the soul also grows in the other. For this is a trait of God's Spirit. The good increases with the good, since there is likeness and conformity between them. Hence our Saviour proclaimed in the gospel, he goes on, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit, John 3:6. John of the Cross ends this remarkable passage on the extraordinary excitation of desires as one moves into the night of sense in this way. I quote, "When the soul enters the dark night, all these loves are placed in reasonable order. The night strengthens and purifies any love that is of God, and takes away and destroys the other." In short, the late antique monastic Eastern wisdom about desiring thoughts, Evagrius and so on, and the complex counter-Reformation narratives of desire's transformation in God, John of the Cross, together give us rich resources for thinking about sorting our desires and for seeking in grace to march in some coordination in the other direction from much of contemporary secular excitations of desire for the sake of money-making. Through these ancient resources, we find ourselves placing Jesus's ethical and spiritual demands within a framework of development, within which his extraordinary palaboric demands of the kingdom are given new point. It is to a practice, a habitus or habituation of desire that we are called, but one with no shortcuts, no promises of instant resolution. But this still leaves us then with questions about how this program of sanctification and transformation, with all its ups and downs and reversals in the life of grace, relates more specifically to the corporate worshipping body of the church, and especially to the worship of the Eucharist. If it is, in Cranmer's words, ourselves, our souls and bodies, which we present at the Eucharist for Christic transformation, how are we now to think of this liturgical act as a participatory and corporate undertaking in the great purification of desire that prayer itself bespeaks? Interestingly, this is not a topic that has been to the forefront of Anglican thinking in every generation since the English Reformation. But in the way that it comes now to new significance, we do well to remind ourselves that there was a particular period within early Anglicanism, as we can call it in retrospect, when this was already a topic of really burning interest. Not insignificantly, in a time of political instability and economic uncertainty, such as our own, as well as renewed fascination with the thought of the early Christian fathers. That is, the very late 16th century and the early 17th century. The theme of erotic desire's relation to our right standing before God runs therefore deeply through the great metaphysical poets, George Herbert, Crawshaw, Donne, and later Milton. And as a study by Ryan Netzley well illustrates afresh, there is this theme uniting all these writers that now requires of us greater reflection. Only recall, as a supreme example, Herbert's wonderful second poem on love, Love 2, which aptly sums up the message I've already been trying to convey through this short lecture about the unification of desire and its relation to God in prayer and praise. Immortal heat, O let thy greater flame attract the lesser to it. Let those fires which shall consume the world first make it tame, and kindle in our heart such true desires as may consume our lusts and make thee way. Then shall our hearts pant thee. Then shall our brain all her invention on thine altar lay, and there in hymns send back thy fire again. True desire for Herbert, comments Netzley, consumes lust in the same fashion as does John Donne's fiery zeal, which doth in eating, i.e. the Eucharist, heal. This is from Donne's poem, I Am a Little World, from Holy Sonnets. But all these Anglican metaphysicals, we need to remind ourselves, wrote in the train of the slightly earlier work of Richard Hooker and his remarkable exposition of the participatory meaning of the Eucharist in Book 5 of his Ecclesiastical Laws, published right at the beginning of the 17th century. As Timothy Squire points out in a nice little article from the journal Liturgy in 2005, the language of participatory intimacy for the Eucharist was already alive and well in Hooker. It's just that we have largely forgotten it. Hooker, in his account of desire-filled sacramental energy, again gives us a vision of intra-divine activity in the Eucharist that rebonds us into the mystical body and gives us all the energy of what we may call proto-erotic permeation. Participation, writes Hooker, is that mutual inward hold which Christ hath of us and we of him, in such sort that each possessive each other by way of special interest, property, and inherent human copulation. Graham Ward, as Squire also shows, reactivates this Hookerian vision when he insists in his book, Cities of the Gods, that the desire evinced in the Eucharist is an expression of divine intimacy unique to itself. Within this cycle of desire, individuals discover a communal unity, which is unthinkable, he says, outside the special erotic presence of Christ Likewise, the contemporary French theologian Emmanuel Falck, working out of a very different philosophical tradition, post-Kantian, Husserlian, Heideggerian, can insist in his extraordinary book, Wedding Feast of the Lamb, that sexual desire of the jaded postmodern lost sort, as he calls it, such as evidenced in the Times article I cited earlier, can rediscover potentially in the longing of the Eucharist a mysterious intimacy with which contemporary sexual desire needs to be reinvested. What is hidden beneath the veil, in Aquinas's terms, in the Eucharist, both mystery and revelation, is what cynical modern sexuality has lost touch with, says Falck. The inexhaustible offering of love, in which human loves too can find their true erotic meaning. And now I come towards the end of this lecture to section 3. The minister as focus of desire, dangers and spiritual discernment. I hear you saying, I think, wait a minute. There are some problems here, and you're not saying that without reason. If we excite all this interest in the erotic meaning of the Eucharist, are we not in dangerous and uncharted territory here, where the possible confusion of sexual loves, often subject to self-delusion or, of course, even abuse, and the expression of Eucharistic love and desire are easily and dangerously confused? Well said, I say. And that is why this short last section of this lecture comes back to sound notes of caution about the moral and spiritual discernment required in any negotiation of the difficult nexus of human and divine desires that we have been trying to rethink preliminarily in this talk. Whereas Evagrius, Gregory of Nyssa, Thomas Aquinas, John of the Cross, Herbert and Hooker represent perhaps now neglected arenas for reflection on the topic we have been looking at. It has to be said that we do not find in them any extensive reflection on the problems of potential abuse, the problems of the potential for the misuse of the ministerial role, to narcissistic or misguided manipulations of eroticism. Yet the fact is that once the nexus of desires I've been charted has been acknowledged in personal prayer, the greater is our understanding of how the priest or minister at the altar, or indeed also in pastoral relations generally, can be in receipt of the reception of desiring projections from the congregation, which must be approached with extreme care and self-knowledge. As such, this projection is in a way normal and unavoidable. To stand in persona Christi at the Eucharistic altar, or to speak his word from the pulpit, is a responsibility of great weight and not to be gainsaid. This responsibility cannot be deflected by improper self-effacement or embarrassment, any more than we should confuse it with our own personal charm or sexiness. That's a real danger that I think lots of clergy fall into. As ministers of the gospel, we become, or should be, Christ's. No longer are we the world's plaything, no longer drawing attention to ourselves by cute clothing, self-referring gesture, or, at the other end of the spectrum, falsely self-abasing denial of this ministerial role. The fact is, we find ourselves in this necessarily what I call proto-erotic zone, bearing the projections of others, whilst at the same knowing that those needs and desires of the people are, strictly speaking, not ours. We are merely in that self-emptying kenotic space where the negotiation of desire is always taking place in the act of worship. Sometimes this will be more obvious to us than at other times, but we should always be aware of its huge dangers. Here is the incipient possibility of abuse, however subtle, if we inappropriately manipulate this power. But we should also be aware of its curious and subtle positive power in the spirit, of which we should not intrinsically be afraid. The fact is that the Eucharist is, at its most efficacious, precisely the place in worship where Christ himself desires with desire. See again Luke 22:15. And so if anything in the unfolding logic of this paper has legitimacy, it is our consciousness of that logic that at all times should have place in our enactment of the Eucharistic prayer. We give way to Christ's desiring of his people. We are ourselves in via to God, and the sorting of desires, so subtle, so profound, and so powerful, is the graced process that we should expect and long to meet in our Eucharistic worship, as indeed in all our prayer and praise. I come now to my conclusions and some questions, because as will be clear, this is a paper that more opens up a space for discussion than aims or even pretends to have ended that discussion. What does all that I've covered in this paper actually mean in practice for the Church today, and especially that in our Anglican and Episcopal tradition? Let me recap the main themes I've covered. I argued first that desire is integral to the life of prayer, because it is basic also to the fundamental condition of frail humanity, body and soul, in relation to God. Desire is also what fundamentally went awry in the fall, and through Jesus's own divine human desiring choices in his temptation and his passion, and indeed throughout his whole earthly life, was righted once more in his sacrificial death and resurrection. So when we ourselves come into that orbit of Christ's death and resurrection and present ourselves, our souls and bodies to him in daily prayer, praise, and Eucharistic observance, the battle of desire is renewed afresh. And the deeper we go into the adventure of prayer, worship, and sacrament, the more we see that there is no escaping the really disturbing darkness of our own distorted and misdirected desires, as well as the way that we're being drawn towards God positively in them. And the more, therefore, we realize that we have to be brought into that transforming crucible of Christ's own grace and transformation of desire. As the Catholic anthropologist Victor Turner saw long ago, it is in rituals of the profoundest sort that these deep and disturbing human forces of desire are summoned, acknowledged, purified, and then redirected in their newly released energy for the moral goods of the whole community. It is a Christian form of this insight that inheres, as I see it, in Eucharistic worship and devotion. As for our Christian minister caught too in the creative nexus of her or his own desires, there is also both danger and delight, as we've seen. Danger, lest he or she falsely identify with the projection of longing that her congregation more or less unconsciously projects towards her. And delight, if by prayerful preparation and what I've called kenotic, self-emptying disposition, she is able to allow her own bodily deportment and gestures in the rite to signal that she herself only acts as she can through the power of the Spirit and in the person of Christ. This is neither play acting nor a false identification with Christ. It is a subtle making way to the working of the energies of Christ and his mystical body that are put into practice in each efficacious act of Eucharistic worship. But whereas, as this lecture has charted, we've inherited much wisdom from the patristic, monastic, early Anglican and Counter-Reformation traditions about the workings of prayer, desire, and worship, the matter of our own bodily disposition in worship in this regard, whether as lay people or as priests, requires, I think, much more thought and insight than it currently garners in our churches and theological colleges. For we are all unconscious victims too of the secular commodifications of our desires and live all too helplessly in that nexus of pressures and demands. We bring them to our own acts of worship. It is for that reason, the unfinished nature of this problem of desire, that I leave you tonight, not so much with succinct conclusions, but with challenging questions of considerable moment for our church as I see it. What are the sorts of necessary preparation, bodily, affective, ascetic, to use an old word, for acts of worship that will dispose both priests and fellow worshippers through the grace and the power of the Spirit to the effective transformation of desires in God? Discussion, by the way, of how we prepare for worship is so out of fashion that I bring it into this space for reconsideration. And how will this generation in the church rethink this particular issue creatively afresh for a culture so constantly manipulated by social media, advertisement, pornography, and the problems of abuse in our own churches, which have been so exposed in our current generation? Our church, of course, now takes enormous measures, and rightly, to deal with this whole arena through safeguarding and protective means of every sort. And I need hardly say that I think this is incredibly important. But what I've tried to show in this lecture is that this whole area is one that is much more pervasive and more deep than something that can be constrained and controlled by merely bureaucratic means. As if to say, we have a little problem here that we have to, as it were, keep under our thumbs. It's not only a little problem, it's the problem of the whole Christian life and the transformation of desires through sanctification. For worship and desire belong together and do so all the way down. And their relationship is ultimately an ascetic one, which involves a lifetime of sanctifying transformation and undergoes through that transformation much trial and suffering for almost all people. And so I submit to you in closing, this is an area in much deeper need of theological and spiritual reflection in our church, if the vivid and alluring life of Christ as the ultimate desire of nations is to be made truly manifest in our life and mission and witness, as well as in our ethical and ascetic lives, imbued, as we hope, with true holiness. Thank you so much for your attention.
Sarah, thank you so much for that. As promised, we're going to take a 5-minute break from Zoom so that we can reorder our desires away from the screen for a few minutes at least. I make it 2 minutes to the hour, so let's reconvene at 3 minutes past, where there'll be a short time for Q&A. Please, if you have a question or you'd like to hear something develop further, please put that in the chat in the next 5 minutes. And we will be finished completely by 20 past the hour. I'll be handing over to Reverend McCluskey for a vote of thanks at 15:15. So, well, it's 17:59, 4-minute break. We'll see you back at 3 minutes past the hour. Thank you. See you soon. So welcome back, and hello, Sarah, who I think is mute, and you're right. So, Sarah, thank you so much. My first question for you, I recognise that the thought you've taken through is around the liturgical and Eucharistic reordering of our desires. My first question, if you don't mind, I'd like to broaden it slightly to what I might call the broader discipling or disciplining of our desires. And I'm thinking of a number of examples known to me. Whatever one thinks around Celtic spirituality, movements like the Community of Aidan and Hilda and Northumbria Community are providing for a lot of people a suitable mechanism for the reordering of life and its desires, I think. I have a friend who is a church leader in Chesterfield who has started a movement called Sober Leader amongst a lot of independent evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and has had a profound impact over the last year in encouraging an awful lot of Christian leaders to reorder their desires and lifestyle around going sober. And I'm also thinking from a slightly different, slightly more controversial origin. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life does the same sort of thing in a different way. So you talked about the desert and desert spirituality and the contemplative tradition. Could you give us some reflections on more broadly how our desires might be modulated, transformed, reordered through other resources within the Christian tradition?
Well, I think all of the three indications you've made have some analogous interests and undertakings, would you not say? I mean, the 12-step program for alcoholics is deeply Christian, really, and it's about sorting our desires at fundamental base, but with the realization that we cannot overcome certain kinds of addiction without the help of others and of God and of the higher power. So movements of spirituality which have grown up in the last generation are greatly to be commended for their interest in this area as well. But what tends to disturb me a little about them is that they tend to witness to the disjunction between institution and spirituality, which has been so popular. And therefore, they don't always, deeply inflect the local church and its understanding of what this task is.
So that's one of your reasons for thinking about the liturgical and Eucharistic.
Absolutely. Because this is the corporate institution of the church, right?
Yes.
Which a lot of people are giving up on for lots of interesting reasons. And I'm very much inspired, I'm writing on this at the moment, by the interactions at the beginning of the 20th century between Evelyn Underhill and her advisor, Friedrich von Hugel, who persuaded her both to remain an Anglican, but also to not give up on the institution as the place which must be pervaded by prayer and transformation.
That very helpful.
So I'm speaking into that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That very helpfully leads me into my supplementary question, which was perhaps asking you to speak directly to us at SEI then in relation to this topic. I quite often refer jokingly to what I call the SAIF word, which is formation. We're seeking to form ministers of the gospel. So what are your thoughts on this in terms of integrating all that you're advocating and all that I've mentioned as well into the lives of our students as they go through formation for ministry?
Well, this could be a very long conversation, but the thing that I find is not always sufficiently reflected upon within seminaries and courses is how ministers, whether they be lay or ordained, actually think of themselves as being the focus of physical and projective attention. And just to quote Underhill again, because I happen to be reading her and thinking about her, famously she wrote to an archbishop and said, you priests, you need to think about God being the interesting thing for people. And when you stand up and are either celebrating the Eucharist or preaching or ministering, how is it that you are thinking about yourselves as preparing for that great longing of people for God? Not by inappropriately self-adulating narcissistically about your importance or charm or sexiness, but by, as it were, deliberately making a space for God to be God through acts of prayerful attention, that I'm not sure that we talk about enough. And I've noticed when I do have conversations with young women and men as they're preparing for celebrating the Eucharist, for instance, for the first time, they often feel they must learn how to use manual acts appropriately, however they are being trained, whether at the evangelical or the Catholic wing of the church. But they don't necessarily think about their particular facial and bodily effects. Some of them naturally want to draw attention to themselves, and some of them don't. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is, this is the space of Christ, and how is it that you are being trained and formed to stand in that awesome space?
So like John the Baptist, we must decrease so that he can increase, for example.
Exactly,
yes.
Absolutely. That's what I would call the kenotic disposition, yes.
My colleague Anne had a similar question around this, around the preparation for worship that follows very directly, I think, onto this. So I'm going to hand over to Anne for a moment. I then have a question from one of our people online, but I'll hand over to Anne first.
Yes, thank you. I was fascinated by what you were talking about, preparing for worship, and it took me back into my own confirmation classes when we were taught to prepare the night before by reading the gospel, etc. And you said that didn't happen so much today. And I was thinking about preparing in a world that is shaped by the Saturday colour supplements. So my question is, who are the artists, the poets that help reframe and shape our imaginations? And the other phrase that was coming into my mind as you spoke was custody of the eyes. So what can we put our eyes on helpfully as we prepare for worship?
Well, I think there are many ways of preparing for worship, and each person will probably have a very special trait. It may be sitting before an icon, or it may be simply coming into the space of the church and there being time, 10 minutes, to be quiet. That's almost gone, hasn't it, from the Anglican tradition? And it's a tremendous loss. The idea that something terribly important is going to happen, life-changingly important. And if you don't think it's life-changingly important, why do you bother to come? This isn't a club. This isn't another optional form of diversion, social diversion. And it depends on the churchmanship of the church, how that's pervaded. There's no one way of doing that right. The atmosphere of the place, the propensity for allowing the space for silent, or perhaps less, not so silent, preparation. But the expectation should be there. And it's very difficult as a priest when you're preparing or just about to celebrate, and in comes someone with some enormous emergency that you've got to deal with instantly. But it's worth thinking about within a parish how you divide up the tasks of the clergy, if you're lucky enough to have more than one. If one of them is in the congregation preparing prayerfully, that actually presents an extraordinarily helpful manifestation of what ought to be happening ideally. And of course, it's very good for the clergy as well. So that's just a very small indication. It's also useful to prepare materials to hand out to people that they might like to read or think about or pray.
Classic Zoom mistake of forgetting to unmute. I think after 2.5 years I'd have got the hang of it. So a question that was sent to me directly in the chat, completely different, but does relate back to something you've already said. Is our theological thinking within our Christian traditions perhaps too much coloured by a negative view of sexuality as something to be overcome rather than embraced? Could the intimacy of the experience of God perhaps be helped by a more positive use of our sexuality and our physical nature?
Well, now, the main difficulty here, of course, is that the presumption is that we've got a choice between puritanical repression and libertinism, letting it all hang out. And a lot of my writing recently is about how that is a false disjunction, especially people who who are gay or lesbian or trans, and who've suffered very greatly from having to be out of sight. To be allowed to be in sight, of course, is enormously liberating. But my message is not that we should all get overexcited by a sort of libertine liberation at all. It's a much harder third way, this one, which is the idea that the arena of sexuality, first, is not disjunct from the other arenas of our life. It's most peculiar how people put the arena of sexuality into some kind of box, which is separate, perhaps, from their, even what they regard as their normal church persona. And therein lies a lot of our problems. And therein lies our capacity to live in these two different worlds and sort of extraordinary lack of fit. So rule number one, our desires actually belong together. And slippage in one can often lead to slippage in another. Gregory of Nyssa thought that gluttony was actually the way in for the devil, for all the other things, not sexuality. So getting it right on food and drink actually may be much more fundamental, more teaching needed in that area. So it's a whole way of thinking about how desires belong to each other and are in this, as it were, I use the word crucible several times, of a lifetime's negotiation of their purification and transformation towards Christ in God.
Thank you.
That idea, I think, is just not generally reflected on.
That's very helpful, and particularly your comment there about food and drink. And I've had reflections with friends in the Pentecostal tradition, where alcohol is not often consumed, about how large so many of the pastors are. So there are other desires that need to be managed as well. Our time has gone, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank you, everyone, for being part of this, and I'm going to hand over now to Reverend Canon John McCluckie, the Rector of Old St Paul's, who's going to present the vote of thanks and then close our time for us.
Thank you.
Professor Coakley, Mother Sarah, thank you so much for leading us through an extraordinarily rich exploration of this field of desire. I have lying in front of me, by entire coincidence, a line from Abba Alonius, who said that if only a person truly desired for a single day, from morning till night, that person would be able to come to the measure of God.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for exploring that territory for us in ways that are deeply honest, in ways that you have helped us to address some of the challenges of our own desires, things that we usually find good ways of avoiding, but also ultimately hopeful. I think you've given us ways into understanding our own desires through the tradition, through some wonderfully fresh readings of John of the Cross and of George Herbert, of Gregory of Nyssa, of Evagrius, of Scripture itself. Ways of seeing that ultimately the path of faith, the path of the Christian life, is one of transformation, the transformation of our desire into Christ. Hopeful because that transformation is for real human lives, and hopeful also because you brought it very strongly into the realm of our experience of the community, the institution of the church. So thank you so deeply for leading us in this territory. You said that you were opening up questions for us as much as giving answers to them, and I have no doubt that each one of us will go from this lecture today with a whole range of questions, and with a deeper, I hope, familiarity with our own desires, and above all, for that greatest desire, which is the desire of God for us, which you so eloquently showed us tonight. So thank you from all of us, and as I say, we will dwell on your words for a long time to come. So I invite you all, in whatever way is appropriate on Zoom, to express your thanks to Professor Coakley, to Mother Sarah, for her wonderful words to us tonight. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.